Hi, and welcome to the Long Range Qualifier for Strategic Edge Gun Range. My name is Tony Schenkel, and I'll be your instructor today. Before we get started, I'd like to let you know that once you complete this class, along with the Long Range Qualifier quiz, and submit it to our office, we will mail you a red LR sticker that shows that you have completed this class successfully, and you will place that sticker on the back of your member ID card, directly behind your date sticker in the front, on the rear, and that will allow you to shoot at the long range facility. Part 1, what lies ahead? Range and berm layout. This overhead view shows you a layout of our range. You'll notice the archery range out front. You'll see the office and classroom, the pistol and carbine bays. Toward the left, you're going to notice the short, rimfire, and long-range rifle buildings and the trap range. Going down range, there are two 100-yard berms, two 200-yard berms, two 300-yard berms, one 500, a 600, a 750, a 1,000, and then a 1,250-yard shooting berm. Next, we'll look at an aerial view of the property. Property in this aerial view would go 3,000 yards by 3,000 yards, and the entire 1,200-yard range would fit in about the length of my hand and about 2 fingers wide in this area. You'll notice in this picture you can't see any people and you don't really see many buildings or structures. And that's a misnomer. When you visit the range as a member and you're new to the facility and you walk over to the long range for the first time, what you see when you look down range are targets, berms, field, trees, and since you don't see anything else, you get a little false sense of security because you think there's no people or there's no buildings down range and that there's no possible way you could fire your weapon and harm anyone or hit something, hit a structure. And that's not true at all. Let's look at the aerial view with our range imposed. If you look at this same view, and we're going to impose in a shaded area the entire range shooting facility and out to 1,250 yards, and you'll notice that in this picture you still can't see buildings and structures that much, so we're going to look at an aerial view and we're going to first look at our range imposed and look at an aim point and then extend that aim point on out to 3,000 yards. And you'll notice if you follow that blue line, which is about where the shooting benches start, all the way through the 1,250-yard berm, if you'll go 3,000 yards down range, you are at Henry Horton skeet and trap range. On any given weekend, there could be 200-300 people at that range, what we would call directly downrange from our shooting position, enjoying their skeet and trap shooting. The next slide, we're going to look at an aerial view with the structures marked and the firing corridor. So in this slide, we've marked the firing corridor as shaded, and you'll notice that there are red circles around every building, the location of every building, which means people, one or more people in each of those. And we may be in the rural South, but you can't go that far in any direction, even in the rural South, without coming up on a structure, coming up on a building, coming up on people. You just can't always see them based on the terrain. And that leads us to the question of lethal range. What are the facts? A long time ago, several years ago, I was testing a weapon at 2,500 yards at another facility out of state, and I came back and I was talking to some of my friends here at the range, and they asked me what I was doing. And I started hearing comments come from one gentleman and then another gentleman. One guy said, well, I bet at 2,500 yards, I bet my bullet would bounce off of you. And the other gentleman said, well, 2,500 yards, I bet I could catch my bullet. It'd be going so slow at that time. So let's look at the facts in case any of you think you could catch a bullet or a bullet might bounce off of you at that kind of distance. Before we do, though, let's look at some common cartridge sizes. We start on the far right with the 22 long rifle, and we lead all the way up to the 50 BMG. So you can see there's many different shapes and sizes of cartridges that are fired on this range. But the question we want to get to is, which do you think are potentially lethal at 3,000 yards? And when we ask people that, we get a little bit of a mixed answer. Sometimes people say, Well, just the last 4, or just the last 3. And they say, well, sometimes they'll say not the 22, but everything else maybe, or not the first 2. And none of those are the correct answer. So I don't deviate from the science of exterior ballistics very often, but the one time that I do is when it involves safety. And I think for safety's sake, what we need to say is all of them. And sometimes we hear that answer, and that's what we teach here, is that you need to have a mindset that any cartridge you fire, any weapon you fire, any bullet that goes in any direction, you're responsible for the final resting place of that bullet and the damage that it causes and the harm that it causes, and that it can go a long ways and it can cause a lot of damage. So we don't want to exclude any of them. We want you to have the mindset, even if it's the lowly 22 rifle, that it's not safe to go out and shoot it up in the air. You have to stop these bullets in these berms. It's imperative that these bullets are stopped in these berms. And small things can happen. It's not always an intentional act. It could be your rifle could be on the bench on an unstable rear bag, and you've got the cartridge loaded, which you shouldn't have, and your safety off, and you're still getting in position, and you might roll the rear of that rifle off of that bag. Well, that change in elevation may just be 4 or 5 degrees, but you don't realize there's 60 minutes to a degree. So at 5 degrees, you've added 300 minutes of elevation, which most definitely will go 3,000 yards or more for most of those cartridges. So you have to be careful of this, and you have to think about the what-ifs as it pertains to safety. Let's take the lowly 308. Sometimes it's referred to as the weak sister of the long-range game because it's ballistically inferior somewhat to most of our modern long-range cartridges. And let's load it into a point mass ballistic solver, and we've got a Palma gun, 155 grain bullet. We're launching it out at a beginning velocity of 3,000 feet per second. What you're going to notice is that it rapidly sheds that velocity in the supersonic range. But when it gets down below the speed of sound and enters the subsonic range, which is around 1,500 yards, at that point it's lost 2/3 of its velocity, or 2,000 feet per second. But what's interesting, if you go on down and look at another 1,500 yards, so now we're at the 3,000 yard mark, it's doing 667 feet per second. So that's just 330 feet per second less than it was doing at the 1,500 yard mark. So again, the first 1,500 yards, it lost 2,000 feet per second. In the second 1,500 yards, it only lost 330 feet per second. Now, at 667 feet per second, how lethal is that? So something that is not talked about in the shooting community because no one likes to talk about bullets hitting people because that's not what we're about. But most terminal ballisticians agree that to enter the human torso, for a bullet to go into a human, it needs to be around 400 to 450 feet per second. So you can see that at 3,000 yards, we're still doing 667 feet per second, well within that. As a matter of fact, let's go another couple of thousand yards past the 3,000 yard mark down to 5,000 yards, and you'll notice that it's only slowed down to 513 feet per second. That is just 150 feet per second less, roughly, than it was doing at 3,000 yards. So it's not bleeding off that speed at that tremendous rate that it was in the supersonic range once it gets into the subsonic range, and that makes it quite lethal at that distance. So this 308 is literally lethal on a human being at 5,000 yards. Now let's take the 338 Lapua mag. It's often referred to as the king of long range. It's a great cartridge to shoot at distance, and we're going to load it into the point mass ballistic solver just like we did the 308 and launch it a 300 grain bullet at 3,000 feet per second. What it does better than the 308 and why it gets its reputation is that it retains its velocity. It does a better job of retaining its velocity in the supersonic range. You'll notice that it gets out to about 2,250 yards before it reaches that 1,000 foot per second mark, where the 308 only got to 1,500. And that's where we get that range, and that supersonic range is where we can really have more control over the accuracy and the precision of our weapon and our shooter. And so we tend to to think in that range, because that's where we shoot, and we don't shoot outside that. But we're not talking about where we shoot. We're talking about what happens when an accident occurs, when a weapon fires off of a bench, or a person shoots off of a berm, and that bullet goes down range. So if you look over at the skeet, where the skeet range is located at 3,000 yards, it's still doing 890 feet per second. So it's close to twice that required to penetrate the human body. And if you go out to 5,000 yards, it's doing 675. It's only about 150 feet per second faster at 5,000 yards than the 308. It's lost that primary drag force off of it. And so once it gets out of the supersonic range, it's lost that center of pressure, that building up of shock waves. That's your primary drag force in a bullet. And that disappears once you get out of the supersonic range into the subsonic range. And folks, these bullets just keep on going and going and going, and they are not bleeding off speed at a tremendous rate like they are in the supersonic range. And it makes them quite lethal to humans that you cannot see, or you don't know they're there, if you don't stop these bullets. We have to stop these bullets at the berm. And this really isn't just for our range or for a range at all. I want all of you to be aware of this, because if you're out deer hunting, you're shooting in your backyard, the same thing applies. If you don't know you're responsible for the final resting place of your bullet and the damage that it causes, damage and harm that it causes. And you need to be aware that they just don't slow down. And sometimes people point to the warnings on boxes, and they look at them and kind of laugh, and say, well, 3 miles, there's no way. Well, yes, there is a way. It's exactly what happens. Let's look at our aerial view with the structures and the 1 mile target danger zone. Now, 1 mile is not that much in yardage. We've been already looking at 3,000 and 5,000 yards. 1 mile is only 1,760 yards. But you'll notice that's our entire gun range from the 1250 back to the firing point. And just a 1 mile shaded area, you'll see how many structures, how many buildings, no telling how many people just in that 1 mile zone. But we move forward to the aerial view with the structures and expand that zone out to 2 miles, a 2 mile danger zone. And you're going to see a much greater number of buildings and a much greater number of people. And the potential there, if you're not being safe, it goes up quite a bit. And 2 miles, again, we were looking at 5,000 yards. 2 miles is only about 3,500 yards. And so you're lethal even outside that zone. It just gives you an example of how many buildings and people you could affect if you're not following the safety procedures at the range. Part 2, rules and procedures. You'll notice on the range and in this picture also, there's a 4-foot sight-in plate with a 12-inch center plate bolted to it, and that is located at almost all ranges except for the 1,000 and 1,250 yard range have a 6-foot by 6-foot sight-in plate with a 12-inch center. In the next slide, it'll show you an example of the 4-footer as it sets out with the 6-footers. Quite a bit larger, but still the same size center plates. Rules. No one can shoot at the long-range facility until they have taken this qualifier class and have the red LR sticker on their membership card. Yes, a guest, a spectator, or a visitor can be in the building to watch, but they cannot shoot unless they have gone through this class or they are with a strategic edge long-range instructor. The long range is not for guests. It's a privilege reserved only for our members, because guests cannot take this training class, this free training class. First shots must be on the 100-yard target to verify a good 0. If your 0 is off, fix it. This applies every time you return to the range, even if it's on the same day. Now, there's 2 subjects there that we need to talk about. As a long-range rifle instructor, I can tell you that the thing that most of my students or most people want to not pay attention to are the fundamentals. And one part of the fundamentals is for you to know what a good 0 is and for you to try to achieve that. And when I ask that question in class, a lot of people try to measure it and say, well, a good 0 is if I'm within an inch of the center of the target, if I'm within 1 MOA, or if I'm within a few tenths of a mil, then they want to qualify it that way. I look at it differently. I say a good 0, and my definition is a little different. A good zero is one in which you cannot improve on that zero by moving your scope in any direction. And what I'm basically saying is you're going to get to the limitations of the click of your scope. If you're in the 10th mil, then the most you can move is about 1/3 of an inch. If you're in quarter MOA, then the most you can move is 1/4 of an inch. So if you're more than half of that amount off of dead zero, you could improve it by making that click and actually getting closer to your zero. The zero is the foundation for everything you do. If your zero's off a half minute of angle at 100 yards, then that half a minute of angle is going to be 5 inches at 1,000 yards, roughly. So you cannot. I guess my advice to you is both for safety and as a rifle instructor, if you want to improve your skills, you need to spend more time zeroing, and you need to be harder on yourself about zeroing and not looking at the edge of that paper tear where you've shot that ragged group, but you need to look at where the center of that group is and move your zero based off the center of that group. And if you can improve it by making another click on that scope, you need to do it. And that would constitute, when you hit the limitations of your optics, of your scope, then you have achieved what I would call a good zero for that day. Now, why would we have to do it? The second subject is, why would we have to do it at the range even if it's on the same day? Well, what can happen to a scope? You shot this morning at the range, you put your rifle and your scope in your car, you went out and got something to eat, went and played a round of golf, whatever it is, you went back home and you decided to come back to the range that evening and shoot. Why would you have to check your zero again? What would change that? And there's several things that could happen. I mean, first of all, the environmentals, when temperature and station pressure and humidity, it can fluctuate a lot, especially in Tennessee. The old joke at, if you don't like the weather in Tennessee, just wait 2 hours and it changes. So that can change, and that impacts your zero as well as your long range data. Other things can happen. You wouldn't believe the number of scopes I've seen break during the course of using them. In class, I think about every second precision rifle class we have, we see a scope that just breaks. They're intricate, they have a lot of parts. There's a lot more parts in a scope than there is in a rifle, believe it or not. Probably 3 times as many parts, I think. A manufacturer told me one time in their scope as you have in your rifle. And it's easy for them to break, and they can stop tracking, they can stop moving, or they can, a crosshair can even, shift on its own, and you're not sure. Your parallax is going to change naturally some throughout the day, and so you're going to have to readjust for that. But also you could break your scope. Another common thing that a lot of us shooters do, and this includes myself, is that we get through shooting and we're dialed up at 1,000 yards, and we're real happy about shooting that little 5-inch gong at 1,000 yards, and we safely, safe our rifle and chamber flag it and take it to our car, and we go home. And when we look at our rifle the next time or on the cleaning bench, we notice that we left our dope from our previous session dialed into the scope. So re-zeroing at 100 yards lets you catch that error. If you already had 35 minutes of angle dialed into your scope and you go to shoot your 100-yard target, then it's going to impact the berm 35 inches above the target point, which is still safe. We still stop that bullet. We don't launch it up, across into the park again, 3,000 yards downrange. But if you got out to 1,000 and you didn't realize that, and this mistake has happened where people have double dialed their dope. They didn't realize because it stopped on a zero or somewhere convenient on your dial, and then the guy puts his dope in a second time and adjusts it, so all of a sudden he's double doped. And at that point, you fired 1,000 yards, and instead of having 35 minutes in, you have 70 minutes. And that pretty much leaves the property, and you don't know where that bullet's going to land or if it's going to hit someone. So forcing people to check every single time they come to range, even if it's on the same day, will give you a heads up if there's a problem. If there's a problem with your scope, if you've left dope in, it's a good practice for everyone to do, and it is required. It's a requirement here at the range, and you need to get a good zero. Now, getting your zero at this range, we don't encourage you to do it on steel, because a steel splatter mark is too big for you to know exactly where that bullet impacted. So we encourage you to use a grid sight-in target, which we sell at the range, and it's got 5 targets on it. It is the only target here that you can leave up. All other targets, the rule is you have to clean up after yourself when you're through shooting. But if you put a sight-in target up at the long-range facility at the 100-yard berm, If you only shoot one spot on it, then you can let the next 4 shooters that come in shoot your target. And along that same line, it's also the only target on the range where you're allowed to shoot someone else's target. And usually the shooters are really polite and ask each other, are you finished with that target, or is there an open spot? And then that saves you from having to wait till the range goes cold to go down range and put up a target. It lets you immediately be able to check your zero, check your gun, and then get to the fun of long range shooting. After your 100-yard zero is verified, your next shot has to be at the 600-yard steel sight-in plate to verify your ballistic data up to that point. If it's off at 600, it's going to be more off at 1,000. So if you look at the ballistic cone of error, you know as distance grows, that error becomes larger and larger and larger and larger. And so what we first want you to do after you've confirmed a good zero is shoot at an intermediate range like 600 yards. And you've got a 4-foot steel target with a 12-inch center plate. That 12-inch center plate represents a 2 MOA target. It should be reasonable. I think it's reasonable, and all the shooters that I know think it's reasonable to say that if your ballistic data isn't tracking and keeping you on the center plate, then something's probably wrong in your calculations. You've misentered a station pressure, or you've gotten the temperature wrong, or your muzzle velocity is wrong. There's something going on there, and it gives you a chance to stop and fix that before you go out to further ranges where you have a much larger trajectory. After your 600-yard ballistic data is verified, you may shoot at the 1,000-yard 6-foot by 6-foot steel target next. If you hit with your first round, you may continue to refine your corrections and shoot at other targets at that distance. If you miss that first shot at 1,000 yards, you have to come back to the 600-yard target and check your data and settings again. Then you have to shoot at the 750-yard sight-in steel before you shoot at the 1,000 again. I'll tell you, this is the official rule for the range. If you've made sure your gun's zeroed, you've shot at a 600, and you get one shot at 1,000, and folks, we're not making this hard. It's a 6-foot by 6-foot backer steel target, and if you know that's the proverbial side of the barn, and at 1,000 yards. If you're not hitting on a 6-foot by 6-foot steel square, then you've got a problem. You've got an issue. The official rule says you can come back to 600 and check your data again. Me personally, I would encourage you to come back to 100 and check your 100-yard zero, because that might have been when the scope broke. I've seen that happen. So it's always good to see if you've had a zero shift. Quickly check your 100-yard zero, go back, but the official rule is at least come back to the 600-yard, check that data again, and check your inputs of whatever you did on your ballistic computer or whatever you dialed into your scope before you make that second attempt. Because next, you're not going to get to go back to 1,000. You have to stop at another distance, which is 750 yards, to see if your ballistic data is tracking up to that point. And you'll shoot there. After the 750, you'll shoot at 1,000 the second shot. If you miss your second shot at 1,000 yards after checking your data a second time, you must stop shooting at that distance and seek help from someone before you shoot at that distance again. Because obviously, it's your second attempt to solve your own problem. And like with most of us, we can't see our own problems until we get some help. So you stop. People are very friendly. You can ask someone to take a look at what you're doing, what you dialed, your ballistic computer. It could be something simple. It could be an input that you did in your ballistic computer that's throwing you off. Because you've already proved to get to that point that you can shoot and hit out to 750, or you wouldn't have been allowed to get to that second shot. So you need to get some help. If no one's here, if you're the only shooter here, you're done for the day. You're not going to be able to shoot at the 1,000-yard target again. But does that mean you have to pack up your gun and go home? No. You've already successfully proved that your data's tracking and that you can shoot all the way out to 750 yards. And let me tell you, one thing that happens on a range that has longer distances, like 1,000, 1,250 yards, is everyone gets the feeling like they got to be shooting at the longest distance. And that's not true at all. Matter of fact, most of our tournaments are won not based on the longest shots. They're one on those intermediate, those 600 and 750s, because that's where the match directors will throw in MOA or mil size. They'll throw smaller targets. For instance, they may throw a half minute of angle target at you at 600 and 750 yards, where they wouldn't throw a half minute of angle at 1,000. It'll just be a minute of angle there. So usually the targets are much smaller at that distance. And also on this particular range, if you observe the terrain and you're learning to read wind, you'll see that some of the most unpredictable wind conditions we have at this range actually occur between 600 and 750. So if you've missed that 1,000-yard target and you can't shoot at it again, then consider spending some time shooting at that 6 and that 750 and refining your dope even more and your wind reading skills even more, and it'll pay you dividends. It doesn't mean you have to go home. It just means you can't continue to shoot when your bullet is not impacting where it belongs. If all your shots at 1,000 yards are good and your group size is less than 1.5 MOA, around 15 inches, and your group is accurate, so it needs to be precise, which means a 15-inch group, and accurate, which means in the center of the target. Then and only then can you attempt to engage the 1,250-yard target. I like to teach my students this saying. There's a saying in college that nothing good happens after midnight, and I like to teach people that nothing good happens after 1,000 yards. Because if you'll look at your ballistic data for any cartridge, just take a 308 for instance, you might be at 35, 36 minutes of angle at 1,000 yards, but you'll notice that you need 58 minutes at 1,250. So in a mere 250 yard, a quarter more of the distance, you've gained about 80% more dope. And so that tells you that that bullet is getting to a point where it's getting high trajectories, it's lost so much velocity, and it's important that you realize that if you're not doing really, really well at 1,000 yards, then you might struggle to stay on the 6-foot plate located at the 1,250 yard berm. Let's take a look at the difference in accuracy and precision. You'll notice in the bottom right-hand target that those shots are scattered and it's neither accurate or precise. The top right target, you'll see a very, very precise group, but it's not very accurate. So you can have precision without having accuracy. You can also have accuracy, which is represented in the bottom left target, without having precision. So it's not a very small group that he's shooting, but he certainly centered that group up on the target. When you get to distances like 1,000, 1,250, or anything in what we call the extended long range, which is anything past 1,000 yards, you really have to have both. You're going to want that mindset of both. You're going to have to practice reloading skills of both and have the equipment and the knowledge as a rifleman to do them successfully. They both matter. Your first attempt on the 1,250 yard target, and any target from 600 to 1,250 yards, has to be on the big square sight-in plate every time you visit the range. In basic terms, your first shot at any range must be on a sight-in plate, and if you fail to hit it the first time, you have to drop back to a distance that you know you can hit. Hits must be accurate and precise before you can move on to the next distance or engage other smaller targets at that same distance. We cannot miss these berms. We do enforce these rules, and as safety officers, that's you agreed to be a safety officer for the range, and as safety officers, it's your responsibility to help us remind others of these rules and to watch for anyone that doesn't have a red sticker and or is breaking any of the rules and report it to the range master. For a competition or a special event, these rules can only be temporarily changed by the range master. These rules are subject to modification if a safety concern is discovered. Commercial activity is not allowed under your individual membership. That's important. We mentioned that in the safety orientation. It's also in this class. You cannot be teaching people for money. You cannot, if you work for a weapons manufacturer, you cannot be experimenting or trying new ammo or weapon system under your individual membership. We have commercial memberships available for that, so be aware that you cannot, commercial activity is not allowed under your individual membership. Anyone found breaking the procedures or rules is subject to having to take the long-range qualifier class again, or you might lose your right to shoot at the long-range facility, or you may lose your membership at the range. This will be left up to the discretion of the range master. Other rules. Recap on the basics. Always keep your firearm pointed in a safe direction. Always keep your finger off the trigger until ready to fire. Never load your firearm until you are ready to fire, and chamber flags are required on this range. As always, rule number 1 on the strategic edge gun range is to use common sense. The 50 BMG, big bore, overbore, and magnum rules and programs apply to the long range facility also. Big bores, overbores, and magnums that exceed 3,200 feet per second at the muzzle should not engage the armored steel at 100 yards. Steel is only, AR-500 steel is only designed to take impacts up to 3,000 feet per second before it starts becoming damaged. If your muzzle velocity is greater than 3,200 feet per second, then you're going to be greater than 3,000 feet per second at that 100-yard target. So you need to limit the shooting of steel at 100 yards based on your velocity. Use a shooting screen on each side of you if possible. Your guns are loud. You want to be friendly to your neighbors. Muzzle brakes cause a lot of noise and off-gassing toward the guy next to you on the bench. So use a shooting screen if possible. Do not let others shoot unless they have passed this qualifier class, which means they had to have been a member and they have to be through this class. And the 100-yard steel target is for sight in and 0 purses only. We put that in there because we see people that sometimes want to get an AR-15 out, and they're just shooting mag after mag after mag at a 4-foot piece of steel. I personally don't know what they're accomplishing by doing that, but it is a no-no. It's not there to be beat on. It's there for you to get a rough sight in for your rifle and make sure that you're safe enough to go to a paper target with a precision rifle. Only target ammo. If you're unsure, then don't fire. No military surplus ammo can be used. No steel or tungsten core ammo is allowed on the steel. Do not use the bolt heads as aiming points, and this is a problem. If you start shooting, some of the precision rifles are very, very, very precise, and shooters are accurate enough that they can actually shoot and hit these bolt heads that hold these targets together. If you do that, it creates an unsafe condition. You will break the bolts and belt heads, and then we have a big, massive piece of steel that could fall on someone when they go down to spray paint. So that's a big no-no. You're damaging the property at that point, and it's frowned upon. Only use target bullets on the steel. Hunting bullets and specialty bullets should not be used. So target bullet, by definition, is a thin copper jacket with a soft lead core infill. And by definition, when you get to hardened bullets, and whether they're brass and copper, or you get to bonded bullets, a lot of times in the hunting industry, you'll have those. Some of those are semi-damaging. They're not armor-penetrating bullets, but they're armor damaging because they hold together, not destroyed easily when they impact the steel. So only target bullets on the steel. Hunting bullets, specialty bullets should not be used. You are responsible for knowing, not guessing, your muzzle velocity, your ballistic coefficient, and the corrections needed, which we call the dope, for the temperature and conditions in which you will be shooting. Now that's a mouthful. That's an easy sentence to look at and to read, but the entire premise behind being a rifleman, a long-range shooter, is wrapped up in that sentence. There's so many things to learn about exterior ballistics. We're not going to get them to them this class. Again, this is a safety class, but we'll cover a lot of that in our introduction to long range, and there's certainly plenty of courses where you can learn in more detail about those factors. But you're going to have to be responsible for knowing these things. Muzzle velocity, your ballistic coefficient, so you can operate your computer correctly. You need to be able to get good corrections, the dope, for the temperature and conditions in which you'll be shooting. Remember, you're a safety officer for our range, and you should act the part. You're responsible for the damage caused by the misuse of your rifle. Part 3, steel targets. Information on steel targets. There are over 3,000 cataloged grades or chemical compositions of steel available. For steel targets to be safe, they should be made of high quality through-hardened steel with a brittle hardness number of at least 500. The hardness of the steel is so critical because only a smooth surface will generate a predictable splatter pattern. You can see in this picture, if you have a smooth surface and a 90-degree strike with a bullet, you'll have a 20-degree cone of spray. If you have a piece of steel that has a pit or a divot in it, and it's a 90-degree impact, then you have an unpredictable angle that you're going to get bounce backs and splatter that come off that target. It's not a good thing. So you want a smooth surface and not a damaged pitted surface. Surface hardened steel is not the same as through hardened steel. True AR500 is through hardened and not surface hardened. If you see a lot of times, if you're looking around the internet and you see someone that's selling steel targets, that say you have a home range and you're going to buy some, and you see them at an extremely good price, a lot of times what you're buying is surface hardening instead of a true through hardened AR500 piece of steel. And it's dangerous because it'll pit faster, it'll bow faster, bend faster, and it'll become dangerous more quickly than a through hardened piece will. More is not better. While 500 brittle is good for steel targets, 700 would be too brittle for ballistic purposes. So if you go too hard on the brittle hardness scale, you go too soft, of course, then it's going to damage the steel easily. If you go too hard, it's going to shatter when something hits it. So 500 is sort of considered the perfect number for steel targets on a gun range. All of a bullet's energy goes directly into weakening the strike point when the target is mounted at 90 degrees, a 90-degree strike. If a target is mounted at slightly less than 90 degrees and the target is able to move a little bit, then a much larger portion of the bullet's energy is deflected in lieu of being absorbed. So we take that same 90-degree strike plate and we lean it forward. In this diagram is 20 degrees of tilt. And you can see that instead of absorbing that energy, we're able to deflect about 65% of that energy straight down. You can tell that when you visit the range and you go down range in the golf cart and you look underneath the steel targets, you'll see that there's actually a trough that's eaten away in the earth below the steel target. All of our targets out here meet that requirement. You can see in this picture where you show not only the 4-footer and the 6-footer, and you can see they're leaning forward and they are able to give a little bit, but even our torso targets, large and small torsos and mid-size, and even our Know Your Limits rack systems are offset bolted so that target hangs backwards a little bit when it's on there, which deflects and puts most of the energy down, makes it a lot safer for a shooter. If you ever visit a friend's range or another commercial range and you see that the targets are not leaning, they're straight up and down, I would greatly encourage you to get back in your car and go somewhere else, because the bounce backs from a rifle cartridge are much more severe than a pistol, and bouncing back 100, 150 yards is completely possible. And what saves you from that is having the correct angle on your steel. So never do that if you're at a buddy's house or any other range. The basic destructive force generated by bullet striking steel is heat. So we learn in high school physics, energy can be neither created nor destroyed. It just takes a different form. So all that energy that bullet is carrying with it, when it hits that piece of steel, it literally dissipates that or turns to heat. The heat generated by a bullet is proportional to the speed of a bullet. Never use rifle ammunition that exceeds 3,200 feet per second on the 100-yard steel. Never use ammunition that travels below 750. So some of the more popular cartridges now, like the 300 Blackout, and they're subsonic. When you shoot them and they're get 750 feet per second or less, it doesn't destroy the bullet on impact. So you're more likely to have some bounce back off of that than you are if the bullet hits and is destroyed. Frangible ammunition can cause more damage to steel since it's often lighter with a higher velocity. Never use steel shot on steel targets. So if you have a shotgun you're shooting, you have some steel shots for game hunting or for duck hunting, and you shoot a piece of steel with those, I can just about guarantee you they're going to come back to you. They're going to bounce back to you. They're not destroyed. And never use steel shot on steel targets. Minimum distance for a rifle or a shotgun slug on steel is 100 yards. Never use green tip or armor piercing ammunition on our steel. Always inspect steel for damage before you shoot. And eye and ear protection are mandatory anywhere at strategic edge when you get near a firing line. Now let me tell you the easy way that you're going to stay out of trouble by breaking one of these rules. The easy way to stay out of trouble is to get a little magnet. Go to the store, get you a little tiny magnet, keep it in your range bag, and before you shoot any lot of ammunition or any different ammo, you need to place that magnet to that bullet. If that magnet sticks to that bullet, it cannot be shot on steel. If it does not stick to the bullet, then it's probably okay to shoot on our steel, provided it's not a hardened brass or copper lathe-turned projectile. Other than that, though, as long as the magnet doesn't stick, then it's safe to shoot on steel. If the magnet sticks, again, that means you've got steel somewhere in that bullet, whether it's a bimetal bullet or whether it's a steel jacket, there is steel there. It will damage the armor. The likelihood of it bouncing back is much higher. It is a no-no at strategic edge. In conclusion, shooting long range carries with it more responsibility, and you are ultimately liable for where your bullet lands and the damage caused. You should continually educate yourself and strive to keep safety foremost in your mind at all times. There is no second chance. On this planet Earth, you cannot take a bullet back once it's fired. Once you send it out the end of that barrel, you've got to be prepared to live with the consequences of where it lands and the damage that it causes. Shooting at our long range facility is a privilege, which may be revoked at any time. We do strictly enforce the range rules, and warnings may or may not be issued. Now, it's the end of the PowerPoint slides, but a couple of additional things for you. At this point, in order to get your LR sticker, you need to go ahead and take the long range qualifier quiz and submit that. And then after that, we will mail you your sticker, which we've already described the location. It goes on the back side of your member ID card. And you'll get that in the mail. Usually we process things about on the Monday, every Monday is when we send them out, and it'll come by U.S. mail, so you can expect to see that. The second thing, though, in addition to this, is when you go to the long range, go slow. Don't be in a hurry to get out there and shoot that 1,000-yard, right off the bat. Go out there and talk to the other shooters. Long-range shooters, more than probably any other discipline I've ever known of, are very, very, very helpful. Matter of fact, sometimes they're too helpful. They want to tell you everything they know. But people are helpful, they're friendly, they will help guide you. If you have questions about things, they'll spot for you, they'll answer your questions. So go easy, don't be in a hurry. Realize there's people out here that have been doing this for a long time and are quite good at it, and they will be happy to help you. Nothing thrills a long-range shooter more, and this is not just for the instructors, but I've seen this for individuals. Nothing thrills a long-range shooter more than helping a newcomer hit their target for the first time, and doing it safely and doing it the correct way. So you'll get some advice, you'll get some help, and that concludes the lesson for today. Thank you for taking this class.